Isabel Mildenhall was on her knees scrubbing the iron grate of the kitchen hearth when her aunt's hand came across her face without warning. The sound of it was sharp. It cut through the quiet of the Mildenhall estate kitchen and left a ringing in Isabel's left ear that she knew from experience would last until midday. She did not fall. She had learned years ago how to take a blow without losing her balance. The kitchen was the oldest part of the Mildenhall estate. The stone floor was black with soot in the corners, worn smooth in the center where generations of servants and family had walked. Iron pots hung from the ceiling beams. The hearth was wide enough to roast 2 deer at once, though it had not been used for feasting in years. Not since Isabel's parents had died in the border raid when she was 4 years old, leaving behind an estate that bled money, a distant aunt who resented the responsibility, and one child who had grown up wolfless. The bread had burned. That was the reason this morning. Isabel had risen before dawn, the way she always did, and gone straight to the kitchen to start the fire and begin the morning loaves. Her fingers had been stiff from the cold because Melissa did not allow her extra firewood for her room on the upper floor. The fire in the hearth had taken longer to build than she expected, and the bread had gone in late, and the cook had not arrived yet, and she had watched the loaves browning and miscounted the time, and the result was a smell of char that reached all the way to Melissa's private chamber and woke her before her usual hour. That was why Isabel was on her knees. Melissa Mildenhall stood over her now, still in her sleeping robe, her dark hair loose and tangled, her eyes carrying that familiar combination of contempt and exhaustion. She was 41 years old. She had the kind of face that had once been handsome, but had settled into severity, every line carved by years of bitterness she had never managed to set down. She looked at Isabel the way most people look at an object that keeps breaking despite all efforts to fix it. "You burned the bread," Melissa said. Her voice was low and flat, not shouting. Melissa rarely shouted. There was something worse about how quiet she kept it. Isabel pressed her lips together and tasted blood where the inside of her mouth had caught against her teeth. "I will bake it again," she said. "I can have fresh loaves ready before the household is seated." "You have said that before." "I will not burn them this time." Melissa looked down at her for a long moment. The contempt in her eyes did not shift. "You are 18 years old," she said. "You cannot bake bread without burning it. You cannot carry water without spilling it. You cannot walk into a room without reminding everyone in it that you are something to be pitied." Isabel said nothing. "You were supposed to shift at 13, Melissa continued. "Then 14, then 15. I waited. I prayed under every moon for 3 years. I followed the old rites. I burned the offerings. I did everything that was asked of me." She stepped back, folding her arms across her chest. "And here you stand, 18 years old and still nothing. No wolf, no mark, no worth." Isabel kept her eyes on the stone floor. She had heard this particular speech, or versions of it, more times than she could count. She did not argue. She had learned very early that arguing only extended things. Inside her own head, the thought moved through her with a dullness that was almost worse than pain. She is right. I have nothing. I am nothing. Even if I wanted to believe otherwise, the proof is right here in my own body. She kept that thought where it belonged, behind her eyes, below her expression. "You will not be nothing forever," Melissa said, and the way she said it carried no comfort. "At the winter assembly before Alpha King Harrison Beckwith, I intend to present you to the court. You will stand before the assembled territories and declare your status. If you cannot provide for this household through your wolf, you will provide through your hands. Servant work, kitchen work, field work, whatever the northern estates require." Isabel lifted her gaze. "Just slightly. You are presenting me to the court? I am demonstrating to the northern houses that Mildenhall understands its obligations. You are my ward. Your wolfless state reflects on this family. The least you can do is be useful to someone." Melissa turned toward the door. "Oh, bake the bread. Do not burn it. And do not speak of this to anyone." She left the kitchen. The door swung closed behind her. Isabel sat back on her heels and pressed the back of her hand against her swelling lip. She stared at the burned loaves still sitting on the iron rack above the hearth, the black edges curling. Her jaw ached. Her ear still rang. She got up, disposed of the ruined bread, and began again. The thought she had not allowed herself to finish earlier surfaced again while she worked. She pressed it back down. She was not going to hope for anything. Hoping made the days harder. Isabel stumbled on the stone steps leading into the grand hall of the Northern Crown Territory when Melissa gripped her wrist and pulled her upright, not out of concern but out of impatience. "Walk properly," Melissa murmured through a fixed smile, her eyes scanning the assembled crowd for anyone who might have noticed. "You are already an embarrassment. Do not make it worse." The grand hall was enormous. It had been built into the mountainside generations ago, before even the oldest living elder could remember. The walls were gray stone, 3 feet thick, lit along the full length of both sides by iron torch brackets that kept the interior warm despite the winter outside. The ceiling vaulted upward into shadow. Long oak tables ran the length of the floor, packed with territory representatives, pack elders, ranking warriors, and their families. Every face Isabel could see was clean and confident. Fur-lined cloaks, polished clasps, the easy posture of people who had never been made to feel small. Isabel kept her head down and her hands clasped in front of her. She counted her breaths, 4 in, 4 out. She wore a dress Melissa had chosen for her. Dark gray, plain, slightly too large at the shoulders. Melissa had tightened the laces herself before they left the estate, pulling them hard enough that Isabel had had to concentrate on keeping her breathing even for the entire journey. The assembly met twice yearly. This was the winter gathering, the larger one, when Alpha King Harrison Beckwith presided over the consolidated report of all northern territories. Pack disputes were settled here. Alliances were formalized, contracts were signed, punishments were handed down. Isabel had never attended before. She had never been allowed to attend before. She became aware of a change in the noise level of the hall before she understood what was causing it. The hum of dozens of conversations dipped, then dropped further, then went almost entirely quiet. Chairs scraped as people rose. He had entered. Alpha King Harrison Beckwith walked the length of the hall from the rear entrance to the elevated throne platform at the far end. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair cut short against his skull. He wore black leather armor over a gray wool tunic, simple and functional, and at the clasp of his cloak was a silver disc bearing the mark of the royal wolf. He moved without wasted motion. Every step was measured and certain. He did not look at the assembled crowd the way someone who enjoyed being watched would look. He looked at them the way a man checks a room for exits. He was cataloging, assessing, filing information away. He did not smile. He took his seat at the head of the hall without ceremony and nodded once to Robert Dalton, the senior council elder who sat to his left. A thick-set man with white hair and the deep-set eyes of someone who had spent 40 years watching people lie to him. Dalton rose and called the assembly to order. Isabel stood behind Melissa at the back of the hall and watched. She was thinking, "Do not draw attention. Stay behind her. Do not speak unless asked. Do not look directly at anyone from the primary houses." The proceedings moved forward. Territory reports, border updates, harvest accounting. But Isabel absorbed it all while keeping her face blank and her posture careful. She noticed things, the way the Alpha King's eyes moved through the room during reports, the way he caught detail in what was said, the slight tension at the edge of his jaw when someone gave him numbers that did not match the previous quarter's ledgers. He was not bored. He was not performing. He was working. Then Robert Dalton called the name Mildenhall. Melissa moved forward through the crowd, and Isabel followed 2 steps behind. They stopped before the council table. Melissa presented herself with a practiced grace, her chin up, her voice clear. She spoke briefly about the estate's contributions to the northern grain supply, about the challenges of managing reduced staff, about her commitment to the Crown's winter levies. She was convincing. She had always been convincing in public. Then she said, "I have brought my ward before the Assembly on a matter of status declaration." A murmur moved through the nearest tables. Dalton said, "Step forward, girl." Isabel stepped forward. She was aware of the eyes. She had always known in the abstract what it felt like to be looked at sideways. This was different. This was a hall full of people looking at her directly, open and unguarded in their curiosity, and already in their judgment. She felt the cold creep up through the stone floor beneath her feet. She kept her hands clasped. "State your name and status," Dalton said. Her voice came out too soft, barely above a whisper. "Isabel Mildenhall, ward of the Mildenhall estate. I have not shifted." "Louder," Dalton said. Before she could draw breath to repeat herself, Melissa's hand struck the back of her head. Not a casual correction, a real blow, the kind that came with intention. Isabel's teeth snapped together. Her vision went white at the edges for a half-second. She caught herself, hands shooting out to the edge of the council table, and held. The crack of it echoed off the stone ceiling. The hall went silent. Isabel straightened slowly, her hand gripping the table edge, blood pounding in her temples. She did not look at Melissa. She stared at the middle distance and waited for the ringing in her ears to fade. She heard a sound, the distinct sound of a chair being pushed back. Then footsteps on the elevated platform, then footsteps descending the steps. She looked up. Harrison Beckwith was crossing the floor toward them. He walked at the same pace he always walked, unhurried, deliberate, but the expression on his face had changed. The cataloging stillness was gone. Something else had taken its place, something controlled and very cold, and the people between him and the Mildenhall position moved out of his path without being asked. He stopped 6 feet from where Melissa stood. "Who granted you permission to strike a member of my assembly?" he asked. His voice was even. It was not a shout. It did not need to be. Melissa's composure held, but only just. "She is my ward. She was failing to comply with a direct instruction from the council. I was correcting her." "You were striking her," he said, "in my hall, in front of my council, while she stood at my table. Alpha, with respect, the management of a ward falls under family law. A guardian has the right to—" "You mistake ward for property," he said, "and you confuse your rights under family law with authority you do not hold in this chamber." Melissa opened her mouth again. Dalton, seated at the council table, raised one hand slightly. She went quiet. Harrison turned to look at Isabel directly. She made herself hold his gaze. His eyes were gray, not cold in the way that came from distance or indifference. Was cold in the way that came from control, from a great deal of feeling being held at a very deliberate distance from the surface. He looked at the mark that had risen on the side of her face. He looked at the way she was standing. "Have you been struck before?" he asked. He said it quietly enough that only she and Melissa could hear. Isabel said nothing. That was its own answer. Harrison turned back to the hall and raised his voice to a level that carried to the last row. "Say, under the ancient right of royal protective claim, I am assuming crown guardianship over Isabel Mildenhall, effective immediately. All prior arrangements are suspended." He looked at Robert Dalton. "Record it." Dalton was already writing. Melissa made a sound that was not quite a word. Her face had gone the color of old ash. "Alpha King, I must protest. I have raised this child. I have maintained—" "You may address your protest to council in writing," Harrison said. He had already turned away. He looked at Isabel once more. "You will come with the Royal Guard when the assembly concludes. Dexter Hayhurst will see to your escort." He walked back to his platform. He did not look behind him. Isabel stood at the council table with her hands still braced against its edge and her face absolutely still, and her heart slamming so hard against the inside of her ribs that she was certain the people nearest her could hear it. The woman who should have protected her had broken her instead, and the Alpha King had risen from his throne to stop it. Isabel flinched when Dexter Hayhurst opened the door of the East Wing chamber. It was not a dramatic flinch. It was the small one, the kind she had spent years suppressing and had not managed to eliminate entirely. Her shoulders came up, her breath shortened, her hands pulled toward each other. Then she registered that it was just a door, that there was no one on the other side who meant her harm, that the door was being opened for her, not thrown open at her. She pressed her lips together and stepped inside. The room was larger than the entire upper floor of the Mildenhall estate. Stone walls but hung with tapestry that kept the cold out. A bed with a frame of dark timber and a mattress thick enough that she could not see the floor on the other side of it when she approached. A fireplace already burning, stacked properly, with enough fuel in the rack beside it to last 2 days. A writing desk, a carved chair, a window that looked out over the northern forest, dark pines under a heavy white sky. Isabel stood in the center of it and did not know where to put herself. She had ridden in silence from the assembly to the northern stronghold in a covered cart with Dexter Hayhurst seated across from her. Hayhurst was the captain of the King's Guard. He was perhaps 35, broad and solid, with a short blonde beard and eyes that had seen enough violence to have stopped being surprised by it. He had not attempted to fill the silence. He had watched her with a steady professional attention that was nothing like the way Melissa had watched her, not looking for failure, just looking. Harrison Beckwith had ridden ahead. She had not seen him again before the cart arrived at the stronghold gates. She heard footsteps in the corridor now, steady, deliberate. She recognized them already. Harrison entered without ceremony. He was still in his assembly clothing, cloak removed now, like his gray tunic practical and slightly creased from a long day of sitting in formal session. He looked at the room, then at her. She was standing in the center of the floor, her bag held in front of her with both hands, waiting. She had not yet touched anything in the room. "Sit," he said. "You are allowed to sit." She sat on the edge of the chair by the writing desk. Harrison stood near the door. He did not lean against the wall the way people sometimes did when they were trying to seem casual. He stood because standing was his natural position. He looked at her bruised face, the redness still visible on the side of her jaw, and his expression did the same thing it had done in the assembly hall. That controlled flatness over something that was not flat at all. "You will not be struck here," he said. "Not by me, not by anyone in this building. If that happens, you come to Hayhurst or to Council Attendant Scarlet Webb, who will be assigned to you tomorrow morning. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You are under Crown protection. That means Crown law governs your treatment. It does not mean I own your time or your choices. You are not a servant here." He paused. "Is there anything you need before morning?" She looked at him. She almost said no, automatically. The way she said no to every question about her own needs, because it was always safer not to want things. Then she stopped herself. "Is there more firewood?" she asked. He looked at the rack beside the fireplace. There were already 8 good-sized logs in it. He looked back at her. "Have more brought up," he said, not to her but to someone in the corridor she could not see. Then to her, "Good night." He left. Isabel sat in the chair by the writing desk and stared at the fire for a long time. She was thinking, what does he want from me? There is always something. Nobody does this for nothing. She did not unpack her bag that night. She left it next to the chair, ready. She slept in the bed, fully clothed. The next morning, Scarlet Webb arrived with a knock that was 3 even taps, patient and unhurried. Nothing like the door-slamming manner Melissa had used. Scarlet was perhaps 22, made with light brown hair wound back at her neck and an efficient manner that was not unfriendly. She brought folded clothing, a dark wool dress and a gray overtunic, both clean and of good quality, and she set them on the bed without commentary. "Those are for you," Scarlet said. "The laundress has your measurements now. More will come." Isabel looked at the dress. She touched the fabric. "Am I allowed to wear this?" Scarlet paused. She had the expression of someone adjusting her understanding. "It is yours," she said simply. "There is no permission needed." Isabel nodded slowly. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had been asking for permission to wear clothing since she was 11 years old, when Melissa had put the house under full status discipline after the second year of no shifting. Over the following days, she struggled. Not with the stronghold itself. The stronghold was orderly and clean and populated by people who, while watchful, did not treat her with contempt. She struggled with her own habits. She apologized when she dropped things. She waited to eat until she saw others eat first. She stood near the walls of rooms rather than in them. She asked permission to go from one corridor to another. On the fourth morning, she spilled a cup of water at the kitchen table and was already halfway through. "I am sorry, I will clean it," when Harrison, who had come to the kitchen for morning bread, said, "You do not apologize for breathing." She looked up at him. "Clean the water," he said, "because it is practical to clean spilled water. Not because you owe anyone a debt for spilling it." She cleaned the water. She did not apologize. That evening, she sat in her room and thought about the difference between those two things for a long time. They felt like the same thing from the outside. They were not the same thing at all. Isabel dropped the silver cup and braced herself, every muscle in her body going rigid before she had even consciously registered what she was doing. The cup hit the stone floor of the council corridor with a clatter and rolled to the base of the wall. No one moved. No voice came. No hand. She stood there in the corridor outside the council chamber with her shoulders up around her ears and her eyes shut and her whole body waiting for something that did not come. After a moment, she opened her eyes, picked up the cup, and kept walking. That had been 6 weeks after her arrival. She noted it because it was the first time she had dropped something in the stronghold, and her first thought afterward had been embarrassment rather than fear. That was different. Different was progress, even if progress felt indistinguishable from grief while you were inside it. She had been given work in the council records room because Scarlett had mentioned, without guile, that Isabel had spent time in the Mildenhall estate ledgers and could read the old Northern script, which many of the younger administrative staff struggled with. It was not glamorous work. She sat at a long table under a lamp and copied trade agreements and border surveys into clean ledgers. But it was quiet, and it required concentration, and concentration was the thing that had always kept her sane. She had been copying a set of salt reserves accounting for the Western estates when Harrison appeared in the doorway of the records room. He paused in the doorway. He looked at what she was doing. "Come to the afternoon council session," he said. She set down her quill. "As a clerk?" "As an observer. There is a trade dispute I want another mind on." She followed him to the council chamber. She sat in the second row of the observer section, us behind the main table where Robert Dalton and 2 of the territory liaisons were already seated. The dispute concerned a request from the Western Border Estates for advance allocation of the Crown's salt reserves. The Western liaison made a competent argument. Dalton was skeptical. The number of barrels being requested was higher than the previous 3 years combined. Harrison listened to the full argument without interruption. When the liaison had finished, Harrison looked at Isabel. Every head in the room turned. She felt the attention land on her like physical weight. She kept her expression even. She looked at Harrison. "Why would the Western Border request salt reserves at this level?" he asked. She thought for a moment. She had been reading those estate accounts for 3 weeks. She knew what the numbers looked like and what they meant. "Because their livestock failed early this year," she said. "The Western Ridge had an early frost in September. If the cattle loss was as significant as the preliminary autumn reports suggested, they would need the salt to preserve what they have before winter makes the loss worse." Harrison looked at Dalton. Dalton looked at the papers in front of him. A pause. Then Dalton said, "That matches the October field report." Harrison nodded once. The request was approved at 2/3 the asking amount, with a review provision in spring. The session moved on. Afterward, when the room had cleared and Isabel was gathering her notes, Harrison stopped at the doorway. He looked back at her. "You read the Western accounts this week?" "Yes." "You connected the Frost report to the salt request." "The numbers told the story if you had the context." He studied her for a moment. "That was useful," he said. She stood very still. Something in her chest pulled tight, not from fear this time. He said it like it was a fact, not a reward, not a compliment designed to manage her. A fact. She had been useful. That was what had happened. He had simply said so. She went back to the records room and sat at her table and pressed both palms flat against the cool wood surface and breathed until the pulling in her chest settled. She was starting to trust him. That was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. The evenings began to change after that. Harrison had developed the habit of walking the battlements at the end of the day, and Isabel had developed the habit of appearing on the lower wall just before he began, and for several weeks they had both pretended this was coincidence. One evening in early winter, the sky above the northern forest was clear enough to show a ceiling of stars that looked like scattered firelight. They walked the width of the upper battlement without speaking. The cold was sharp but not punishing. The pine smell was clean. He stopped at the far corner and looked out over the territory. She stood beside him. "How are you sleeping?" he asked. She thought about how to answer honestly. "Better than before," she said. "Not yet well. That will change." "You sound certain." "Because I have seen it before," he said. "People who have been afraid for a long time take a long time to stop. That is not a flaw. It is a consequence." She looked at his profile. In the firelight from the torches on the wall, his face was harder to read than usual. "You brought me here," she said. "You could have sent a council order. You could have handled the Mildenhall situation through Dalton." "I could have." "Why did you come yourself?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, the quiet of someone deciding how precisely to answer it. "Because a council order takes 6 days to process," he said. "I did not want to wait 6 more days." She held that for a moment. He had not said he pitied her. He had not made it about rescuing something broken. He had simply said he had not wanted to wait. She turned her face back toward the forest so he would not see what his answer had done to her expression. Isabel reached for Harrison's hand first. She had not planned to. She had been sitting beside him in the private study chamber where he did his late reading, close enough that the warmth from his side reached her, watching the fire burn low, and her hand had moved before the thought formed behind it. Her fingers found his wrist where it rested on the arm of his chair and stopped there. He did not move. The study was small by Stronghold standards. Stone walls, 2 chairs facing the fire, a desk covered in papers he had not gotten to yet, a single lamp on the desk. The door was closed. Outside, the keep was quiet. It was past the hour when the rest of the household had retired. Her fingers lay against his wrist. She could feel his pulse beneath them, steady, controlled. Everything about him was controlled. She was thinking, if he steps back now, I will survive it. I have survived worse than this. But if he stays, everything will change. I do not know if I am prepared for everything to change. Her fingers trembled slightly. She did not pull them back. "You see me," she said. Her voice was even. She had practiced being even-voiced. "I mean, I know you see the wolfless girl, the ward, the responsibility, but sometimes I think you also see—" "Yes," he said. She stopped. "I see you," he said. "I have seen you since the assembly, not the wolfless girl, not the ward, you." She turned her head to look at him. He was already looking at her. His gray eyes were not doing the cataloging thing. They were doing the other thing, the thing she had noticed 6 weeks in and had refused to name for 3 weeks after that. "Then do not protect me like I am fragile," she said. "I would protect you because you are valuable," he said. "Not the same thing." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she leaned across the space between the chairs, slowly, giving him every opportunity to turn away from it. And he did not turn away. He met her halfway, his hand coming up to the side of her face, his thumb against her jaw. The first touch was careful, the way you touch something you have been waiting a long time to touch and want to do it right. The kiss was slow, not urgent, not the pressure of someone taking something, the pressure of someone who had been waiting and had decided that waiting was finished. When she pulled back, her face was warm and her breath was not quite steady. Oh, he looked at her the same way he always looked at her, like she was the most important thing currently in his field of attention. "You are not beneath me," he said quietly. "Remember that." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know." That was the first time she had believed it while saying it. What followed that night was gentle and deliberate, and nothing like what she had feared intimacy might be. Harrison was careful with her in a way that asked, in every movement, whether she was certain. She was. She answered every question he did not say out loud. When he held her, it was with the settled weight of someone who was not planning to leave. Afterward, they lay in the firelight of the study chamber, her head against his shoulder, his hand moving in slow, even strokes down her arm. The fire had burned low. The lamp was out. "I did not know it could be like this," she said. "Like what?" "Safe," she said. "I did not know it was supposed to feel safe." His arm tightened around her, not dramatically, just enough that she felt it. She stared at the ceiling and listened to his breathing and thought, for the first time in her life, that she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. In the days that followed, the quality of everything changed. Not the work, not the routine, not the council sessions or the records or the long evenings on the battlements, but the feeling inside all of those things was different. She stood straighter. She spoke first in conversations instead of waiting. She stopped asking permission to exist in rooms she was already standing in. Scarlett noticed. She said so, not with a speech, but with a small approving look one morning over the breakfast table that Isabel caught and understood. Dexter Hayhurst noticed. He had taken to exchanging brief, direct nods with her in the corridors. The kind of acknowledgement one gives to someone who has earned their place in a building rather than just been placed in it. Harrison noticed. He told her once, walking back from the outer training yard where she had been watching the guard rotations as part of understanding how the Crown's security structure was organized, "You have stopped apologizing for your presence." She said, "You told me not to." He said, "People are told things they do not do." She thought about that for a moment. "I decided it no longer served a purpose," she said. "Apologizing accomplished nothing." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved in the way it sometimes did when something amused him without surprising him. She kept walking. Melissa Mildenhall arrived at the Stronghold gates on a Tuesday, which was also the day Robert Dalton had scheduled the quarterly council review. Isabel was in the outer courtyard reviewing grain transfer counts with the estate clerk when Dexter Hayhurst appeared at her elbow. "Your aunt is at the gates," he said. She looked up from the papers. He read her expression and said with professional calm, "The Alpha King is in session. Your call, Miss Mildenhall." She handed the papers back to the clerk. "I will go." She did not run to find Harrison first. She walked to the Royal Court Hall, the formal chamber used for official audiences, and she waited in the center of the floor while Melissa was brought in. Melissa had dressed carefully. Her traveling cloak was dark blue, her hair was pinned formally, her face was composed. She had always been good at composing her face. She looked at Isabel with the same assessing look she had always used, looking for something that had slipped, something that could be criticized. She found nothing. That seemed to unsettle her more than anything else would have. "You look different," Melissa said. "I have been here for 2 months," Isabel said. "I came to speak to the Alpha King." "He will be informed that you are here," Isabel said. "I will hear your business first." A flicker of something crossed Melissa's face. She had not expected this. "You hear my business? I am under Crown protection. Any matter concerning me comes through counsel procedure, which begins with formal review before witnesses." She kept her voice even. She had learned that from Harrison. Not from imitation, but from understanding why it worked. "What is your business?" Melissa studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "There are people at the assembly who are questioning the Alpha King's judgment. A wolfless girl placed under royal protection, elevated above the station she was born to. They say she has influenced him." Isabel said, "That is not a legal matter. That is gossip." "I am making a formal declaration," Melissa said, and her voice sharpened. "That Isabel Mildenhall, being wolfless and of no rank, has used irregular means to obtain favoritism from the crown, and that the Alpha King's protective claim should be reviewed before it calls his fitness to rule into question." The door at the far end of the hall opened. Harrison came in with Robert Dalton 2 steps behind him. Both were in council formal dress. Harrison had been in session. He had clearly been told mid-session that something required his presence. He took in the tableau, Isabel in the center of the floor, Melissa across from her, and walked to the raised seat at the end of the hall without hurrying. Dalton took his position at the council table to the side. Melissa turned to address him directly. "Alpha King, I have come to formally dispute the protective claim on the grounds that—" "You will address council," Harrison said. "Not me. Dalton will record your dispute." Melissa hesitated. She had wanted him. She had wanted to direct this at him because he was the one she believed she could affect, the person who had taken her ward, the person whose judgment she was questioning. Being redirected to Dalton was not what she had come for. She began again, addressing Dalton, but her eyes kept moving to Harrison. She laid out the accusation. Influence, manipulation, inappropriate elevation. Dalton wrote carefully and without expression. When Melissa finished, Harrison did not speak immediately. He was looking at Isabel. Isabel was thinking, "Do not shrink. You know what you have and have not done. You know who you are. Stand in it." She straightened fully and turned to Dalton. "Permission to address the formal declaration?" Dalton looked at Harrison. Harrison said nothing. That was its own permission. Isabel said, "I was brought to this stronghold after being struck in the assembly hall in front of the council. That blow was not the first. I was struck at home before I could shift. I was struck when I spoke too quietly. I was struck when bread burned because my hands were cold from a room with no firewood in winter." She paused. She was not going to let her voice shake. "I was told every day of my life that I was useless, that being wolfless made me less than the people around me. I spent 18 years believing that because it was all I was ever told." The hall was quiet. "I am not less," she said. "I know that now. Not because someone told me I was valuable, because I have had silence. I have had time. I have had real work to find out who I am when nobody is telling me who to be. And what I found out is that I am not broken. I was simply never given a fair chance to be whole." Melissa's jaw tightened. She said, "You have always been dramatic." The blood moon began its rise outside the high windows of the hall. Isabel had been aware of it all day, the way the air felt heavier than usual, was the pull at the base of her spine that she had learned over the years to ignore because it never went anywhere. It went somewhere now. The feeling moved through her from her feet upward like something waking from a very long sleep. It was not painful. It was not violent. It was pressure, enormous and building. And then it was something breaking open, not her body but the thing that had been locked inside it, held back, held down. I held quiet for 18 years by grief and fear and the accumulated weight of being told she was nothing. The mark appeared on her shoulder first. Silver white, the shape of a crescent interlocked with the royal wolf crest, visible even through the wool of her dress because it was giving off its own faint light. Robert Dalton stood up from his chair. Dexter Hayhurst, who had been standing by the door, moved 3 steps forward and stopped. Melissa stared. The color drained entirely from her face. Isabel had not shifted into her wolf form. Not yet. That would come later under the full night of the blood moon outside in the snow. But the seal was broken. The suppression, built up through years of terror and grief, had released. What came through the break was old. It was powerful. It was absolutely, distinctly royal in its character. The light from the shoulder mark reflected in Harrison's gray eyes across the length of the hall. Dalton said very quietly, "Ancient bloodline, sealed royal line. She was never wolfless." He looked at Harrison. "Her parents' lineage. The Mildenhall line traces back to the Northern Crown's third dynasty. It was always there." Melissa made a sound. It was not a word. It was Melissa who went to her knees, not Isabel. She sank slowly, the way someone sinks when the ground beneath them has given way and there is nowhere left to stand. Her carefully pinned hair had come slightly loose. Her composure, which had survived 41 years of hard choices and harder ambition, had not survived the sight of that shoulder mark. Harrison did not speak first. He waited. The hall held its breath. Robert Dalton had his pen in hand and was not using it. Dexter Hayhurst had gone very still near the door. The blood moon outside the high windows was climbing, and the light it threw through the stone arches was bone-white and precise. Isabel stood in the center of the hall with that light on her face, and the mark burning silver-white on her shoulder, and her spine straight as a blade. She was not shaking. She had been waiting her whole life to not shake. She let the moment run its full length. Then she turned to Dalton. "Under Crown law," she said, "I would like to know the formal status of a sealed royal bloodline that was concealed from the bearer." Dalton cleared his throat. He looked at his papers as though they had answers, but he already knew the answer. He had been counsel to the Northern Crown for 30 years. "A sealed bloodline held under documented guardianship," he said carefully, "with evidence of physical harm to the bloodline heir, I constitutes a charge of treason under the ancient Pack Compact." Melissa's breath came out in a fractured sound. "The ancient compact," Harrison said, standing now from his seat at the head of the hall and speaking with the full weight of his position behind every word, "exists because the Northern Crown recognized 3 centuries ago that bloodline heirs were vulnerable to the very people entrusted with their protection. The compact exists for this reason. The compact was written for exactly this case." He came down from the raised platform and walked the length of the hall until he stood beside Isabel. He did not stand in front of her. He stood beside her. Under Crown law, the abuse of a royal blood heir by her designated guardian constitutes an act of treason against the Northern Crown. Melissa looked up from the floor. Her eyes found Isabel's face. For a moment, underneath the fear, something crossed her expression that might have been recognition, might have been the beginning of understanding how thoroughly she had been wrong. It came too late. It was not a thing that changed what had happened. "I did not know," Melissa said. Her voice was rough. "I did not know what she was." "You did not need to know what she was," Harrison said. "You needed only to treat her as a person in your care. You did not do that." Melissa had nothing to answer with. Isabel looked down at the woman who had raised her, who had hit her every morning, who had made her count her breaths in public spaces and apologize for burning bread and believe that she was fundamentally, permanently less than everyone around her, who had stood in the Winter Assembly Hall and struck her in front of the Crown and a room full of Pack leadership without a moment's hesitation. She felt something she had not expected. Not the rage she might have predicted, not grief either. Well, not exactly. What she felt was a clean, clear-edged finality, the kind that comes after a long illness finally breaks. "I do not want your imprisonment," Isabel said to Melissa. "I want your removal. I want to never be in the same room with you again. I want you to spend whatever years you have left knowing that the thing you tried to destroy was never destroyable, and I want that to be enough." She looked at Dalton. Record the charges under the compact. Let the formal process go where it goes. I am finished speaking about this, Dalton wrote. Harrison stood beside her and said nothing because nothing was required. Outside, beyond the windows, the blood moon had reached its full height. The light that came through was no longer white. It had shifted toward silver, the particular shade that accompanied the old magic, the deep pack law that no council order had ever fully codified and no crown had ever fully controlled. It existed beneath all of it. It existed in Isabel. Dexter Hayhurst stepped forward and escorted Melissa from the hall. The formal proceedings would follow in the days after. The compact charges would be filed. The council would convene. All of that would happen. For tonight, it was done. Harrison and Isabel stood alone in the hall. She looked at the windows, at the blood moon light spreading across the stone floor. The mark on her shoulder was warm. It had stopped burning and settled into a steady, even warmth, like something that had been waiting and was now simply there, present and patient and done with waiting. "You knew," she said, not accusingly. "You knew there was something sealed in me." "I suspected," he said. "The way you read people, the way you processed information, the strength in you that had no source I could name from your circumstances. Something was closed off that should not have been closed. But you did not know it was royal." "No," he said. "I knew it was significant. I did not know the extent of it." She was quiet for a moment. The hall was very still. "Does it change things?" He turned to look at her. "Does what change things?" "What I am. What the mark means. The bloodline." She held his gaze. "Does it change why you brought me here?" "No," he said. "I brought you here because you were being beaten by a woman with no right to beat you, and I was not willing to wait 6 days for a council order to stop it." He paused. "The bloodline is yours. What it means for the crown line and succession, Dalton will walk through that process in the morning. What it means for you is that you were never what they told you you were. You were protected by something you could not access. I was protected by something that kept me from protecting myself," she said. "The seal was not a weapon used against you," he said. "It was an ancient mechanism. No one alive chose it. But you are right that it compounded what you suffered. That is true, and it will not be unsaid." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "I want to go outside." He said, "Yes." They went out through the stronghold's eastern gate and walked together into the open ground between the outer wall and the beginning of the northern pine forest. The snow was an inch deep and clean, untouched by footprints. The blood moon sat high above the tree line, massive and silver white, and its light turned the snow into something that looked almost like water. Isabel stood in the open ground and lifted her face to the sky and let the moonlight fall on the mark on her shoulder and felt, for the first time in 18 years, her wolf begin to rise. It was not violent. It was not the brutal, grinding shift she had always heard described by people who had come to it late. It was the feeling of a door opening that had always been there, that she had always walked past because she had believed it was sealed shut. The door had always been there. It had simply needed the right moment. She shifted. Her wolf was silver white, not the gray of a common pack wolf, not the pale silver of a mid-ranking warrior line, the specific, clear, high white that appeared, according to the ancient records, only in the direct bloodline of the Northern Crown's 3rd dynasty. She stood in the snow on 4 steady legs and breathed the cold air through her wolf's nose, all the deep detail of it, a pine and snow and stone and wood smoke, and the specific warm particular scent of the man standing 6 feet behind her, watching. She turned and looked at him. Harrison Beckwith, Alpha King of the Northern Crown Territory, was standing in the snow in his council clothes with his hands loose at his sides and his gray eyes on her wolf, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was not the satisfaction of someone who had been right about something. It was something quieter, something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed to exist on his face. She shifted back, standing again, barefoot in the snow, the warmth of the shift still running through her. He held out his cloak without being asked. She took it and pulled it around her shoulders. They stood together looking out over the northern pine forest under the blood moon. "You were never broken," he said. She did not hesitate this time. "No," she said, I was not." "What were you, then?" She thought of the kitchen hearth, the assembly floor, the night he stood between her and a raised hand. "I was waiting," she said. He stood beside her in the snow, and he did not put his arm around her or make any motion that would reduce what she had just said into something smaller than it was. He simply stood there, steady, with her. Below them, in the valley where the northern territories spread out under the blood moon's light, the crown lands ran for 3 days' ride in every direction. Pack holdings and villages and forests and river crossings and all the ordinary continuing life of 1,000 people who did not know yet what had happened in the royal court hall tonight. They would know tomorrow. Word would travel, the way word always traveled in pack territories, fast and through every channel at once. Isabel Mildenhall, ward of the disgraced Mildenhall estate, once wolfless and beaten and dismissed, was not who anyone had believed she was. She was not the mistake her aunt had named her. She was not the unfortunate the assembly had quietly dismissed. She was not an object of pity. She was the last direct bearer of the Northern Crown's sealed Third Dynasty bloodline, which had not appeared in 3 generations, and her wolf was royal white, and she had shifted under the blood moon at 18 years old in the snow outside the stronghold of the man who had risen from his throne to stand between her and a raised hand in a public hall. Not because he had pitied her, because he had seen her. She looked out over the territory and breathed cold air through her own lungs, not counting anything, not bracing for anything, just standing, just being entirely where she was, with the person beside her who had refused to look away. "What happens next?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Harrison said. "We sit with Dalton and go through the formal bloodline recognition process. That will take several days. After that, the territories will need to be formally notified. After that," he paused. "After that, we see." "We see," she said. "You have had 18 years of other people deciding what came next for you," he said. "I am not planning to take over that role." She looked at him sideways. You did pull me out of an assembly hall." "You said yes." She thought about the night she had agreed to go with him, her mother's face in the doorway, the carriage pulling away into the trees, the sense of leaving one country and entering another without knowing what the second country would cost her. "I did say yes," she said. "You can say yes again," he said. "When you are ready. There is no rush." She looked back out at the territory below. The snow on the trees, the silver light, the particular quiet of a winter night in the north that sat in the chest like something clean. She said, "I think I am already ready." He turned to look at her. She looked back at him. "Then we see," she said. They walked back through the stronghold gates together, his cloak still around her shoulders, the blood moon lighting the way.